Hey, so if you are here with us for Science Colloquium, welcome. Today we're going to have Giana Amador, and she's going to talk about science policy, innovation, action, looking at carbon and climate. And I do want to invite you guys to join us in 2 weeks. We have our own Jamie DeRollo from MJC. She's our head athletic trainer, and she's going to talk about concussions, keeping the head out of the game, and traumatic brain injury. So I hope you can join us then. And thank you for being with us. We are going to start our presentation at 3:15. So if you're just waiting, just hang on a minute. We just want to let other people join us today. Thanks. All right, Troy, if you want to take it away, it's all yours.
All right, well, welcome everyone to the February 24th edition. We're glad to have everyone with us today. We've got a great speaker with us today. It's kind of a nice homecoming, although she's not here with us, but she is able to share some information with us. I'd like to introduce you to Giana Amador. She is a local product of the Valley here. She went to Turlock High School and kind of through MJC, through her father, who was an instructor here at MJC. And then she went to UC Berkeley, and she was involved in some of the cool climate calculator stuff that they were doing at UC Berkeley, which is really cool. We use that in our environmental science class a little bit here. So it's nice to have her with us. She's currently the co-founder and managing director of Carbon 180. And so she's actually working out of the DC, New York area, although she's coming to us from sunny Hawaii today. So we're happy to have her with us today. She's going to talk about science, policy, innovation, carbon sequestration, and I got a sneak glimpse at her PowerPoint last night, and it was really cool. So really excited to have her join us. Giana, it's all yours. Thank you for coming today.
Yeah, thank you so much for that great introduction. Always great to chat with the MJC community, and really excited to share more about Carbon 180 and our work on climate change. I'm going to get my slides up quickly, and we can get started. Just one moment. All right. So yeah, again, thank you for the introduction. Just again, I'm Giana Amador, Managing Director and Co-founder at Carbon 180. And we're a nonprofit that's on a mission to fundamentally rethink carbon. And in particular, we're really focused on fighting climate change by advancing a specific set of solutions called carbon removal, which I'll chat more about and sort of give more details about throughout this talk. But if you have any questions about my presentation or anything that comes up, feel free to pose questions on the Science Colloquium page, and we'll definitely leave some time at the end to answer them as well. So I wanted to start this conversation just with these two photos. And again, we're here to talk about climate change and the impacts that it's having on our globe and on our community. And I think these two photos are really powerful. The one on the left is a photo of the wildfires that were happening in California in 2020. It was the worst wildfire season that California had seen over the last decade and burned over 4 million acres of both forest and urban land. The photo on the right is a photo from Texas, just taken a couple weeks ago during the severe and unusual snowstorm that happened that left a number of communities without access to power, water, and food. And I think the point of showing these photos isn't really about like scaring anyone. I think for me, it's really about the urgency of the climate crisis and the fact that we're already seeing the impacts of climate change. It's not something that's going to happen 10 years down the line. It's something that's happening to us today. It's happening to our communities, and it's affecting our livelihood. When we think about climate change, we often measure climate impacts as average increases in temperature, and those temperature numbers represent sort of a whole other shift in climate dynamics that create things like these severe weather events like wildfires and hurricanes and snowstorms. We've already started to see about 1 degree Celsius of warming across the globe on average, and that is what is causing these impacts today. In addition to that, it's not just these sort of, devastating, dramatic climate impacts, but it's also something that's just gradually shifting our climate and economies. I wanted to share this article or series of articles from KQED that talks about California agriculture industry and how they're beginning to adapt to climate change. And it's talking about how farmers and ranchers are trying to adapt to things like increased temperatures and shorter winters and more frequent droughts. And so it's not just something that, every year we have some sort of extreme weather event, but it's actually affecting our communities and economies on a daily basis, which again, I think just really drives home the fact that we need to start implementing climate solutions now and really find a way to continue to thrive under the impacts of climate change. So maybe just level setting a little bit with some background on climate change. Carbon naturally cycles through our Earth. It's not necessarily something that's bad. It's embedded in our soils, our forests, our oceans, and our atmosphere. And since the Industrial Revolution, through the extraction and use of fossil fuels for electricity, energy, building materials, as well as our land management changes, we've put a significant amount of carbon that used to be stored in our biosphere, which is sort of this section at the bottom, if you can see my mouse, into the atmosphere. And that in turn is causing climate change. And so really the core problem comes down to that carbon in the atmosphere. And so when we're thinking about addressing climate change, typically there are two main strategies that get brought up. The first is around reducing emissions. So this is about putting less carbon into the atmosphere through technologies like renewable energy, producing solar and wind, adopting electric vehicles, low carbon building components, and altogether putting less carbon in the atmosphere. On the other hand, we also talk about adaptation to climate impacts. So if we're experiencing things like increased sea level rise, how do we build seawalls to protect our coastal communities? Or if we're seeing more frequent droughts and flooding, how do we help farmers become more resilient or use crops that are resistant to some of these climate changes? But there's actually a missing piece that often gets talked about, that often doesn't get talked about when we're thinking about addressing climate change, and that's carbon removal, which again is what Carbon 180 focuses on. Back in 2015, my co-founder Noah Deitch and I were at UC Berkeley, and the UN climate science body, which is called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, had just released a landmark report. It's called the Fifth Assessment Report. And it's a like 5,000-page document on climate change, climate science, what are climate impacts, and really what's the path that we need to take in order to avoid those impacts over time. And buried about 600 pages deep in that document, there was an assumption that a lot of people weren't talking about, which is in order to meet our climate goals, we needed to not only reduce emissions, but also clean up carbon that was already in the atmosphere. The only problem was that those solutions were largely underexplored, very immature, and really no one was talking about them. So we started Carbon 180 5 years ago to really shift that conversation and bring these solutions to life. Going back to the carbon cycle, just for a second, I think the original graphic I showed can get very complicated with all of those like stocks and flows, but really I think there's a simple analogy, which is the bathtub, to help explain what are the issues that we're facing with climate. So if you think of the atmosphere as a bathtub and the CO2 in that atmosphere as water, there are sort of three things that we need to do. So one, what we've seen over time is that we're increasing the amount of water that's in the bathtub, and it's causing that bathtub to overflow. So the first thing we need to do is turn off the faucet. So stop adding more water into the bathtub. And therefore, which is sort of analogous to reducing carbon emissions that we're putting in the atmosphere. Two, we need to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So essentially grab a mop, clean up the clean up the water that's already on the floor. And then three, remove carbon. And that's really about increasing the size of the drain on the atmosphere or on that bathtub. And it's really going to take all three of these different levers in order to solve climate change. So thinking about charting our path towards fixing climate and going back to those temperature goals that I talked about earlier, when we talk about meeting our climate goals, again, we use those temperature measures as almost a proxy for the other climate impacts that we'll experience with that amount of warming. So the sort of global agreed upon number for climate change is limiting warming to either 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I have this graphic on the screen that really shows what's it going to take to move us from business as usual, which is the yellow line at top, where our emissions would be with no action, to this sort of red line that would keep our emissions below, or to keep the climate impacts below 2 degrees Celsius. And what you can see is that a large portion of the activity that we need is around conventional abatement technologies, again, reducing emissions through things like renewable energy. But there's actually a pretty big portion in that blue section at the bottom that we actually need to remove carbon. And these estimates say that we need to remove about 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year by 2050, which is a pretty significant amount. It's about 1/4 of total global annual carbon emissions that would need to be removed from the atmosphere every year in order to meet our climate goals. And while that is a very daunting number, I think the great news is that there are a number of solutions in our back pocket that span across sectors of the economy that can really get us to that 10 gigaton number. So typically we think of these solutions in sort of two sections. The first is on the land sector side, and then the other is technology based. And they all sort of have various maturities, benefits, costs that would make them sort of promising or probable solutions in order to help us reach that 10 gigaton number. So on the land sector side, these are solutions that use photosynthesis to capture carbon, either through forestry, agriculture, coastal ecosystems, anything that uses natural processes to capture carbon. And then on the tech side, we're actually using chemistry to mimic or speed up natural reactions. So a technology that gets talked a lot about on the tech side is called direct air capture, which is essentially a large fan that pulls air through it, selectively binds with the CO2 in order to capture it from the air, as well as some more nascent solutions for things called enhanced weathering, which involve the sort of mining of rocks that naturally react with carbon in order to speed up the sort of natural geologic sequestration that happens across the globe. So that's just a sort of high level of some of the solutions that we can use to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Definitely going to dig into some of the more promising solutions and the solutions that Carbon 180 works on. I think one thing before we move on that's important to touch upon is just really that portfolio approach. No one solution here is going to get us to that 10 gigaton number. It's important for us to try to pursue and develop and deploy all of these solutions. I think about it a lot like renewable energy. You put solar where it's sunny and wind where it's windy. And so the same goes for carbon removal solutions, where we have abundant forests, abundant agriculture lands. We use those strategies, and where we might have access to energy or unused land, we might put direct air capture. So really thinking about how do we build a new industry that's really focused on taking carbon out of the air and really pushes all of these solutions forward. And I want to dive a little bit more into the land sector solutions. And I think, again, a really promising thing here is that the land sector is already a really powerful tool. So in the US alone, the land sector captures about 1 gigaton of CO2 each year, and that's equal to about 11% of total US annual greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide. So we already have the land sector compensating for a lot of emissions across other sectors. And what we're trying to figure out is how do we bolster the carbon that's in those sinks, protect them, protect what carbon is already stored, and increase the amount of carbon that they're storing over time. So the first solution I want to talk about is forests. I'm sure this is one that people are very familiar with already. But the challenge is how do we manage our forests to store more carbon? Planting new forests or managing forests is a relatively cheap solution, but it's something that's limited by scale because of our needs for food production and urban environments. We can't just plant forests everywhere. So a lot of the work that we do is thinking about how do we manage the existing forests, protect the forests that are already standing from wildfires, and find sort of other methods to reforest areas that used to be forested. I think one of the challenges with land-based solutions generally is that a lot of the carbon is vulnerable to reversal. So if the trees are chopped down or that area experiences a wildfire, the carbon that you've stored actually gets released back into the atmosphere. So you also need to think about the permanence of that carbon and how we maintain it over long periods of time. So it's actually relevant for fighting climate change. A couple different forest approaches that I want to point out really quickly. The first is reforestation. So this is planting forests where there used to be forests and are no longer. So either after a wildfire or some sort of logging. 2 is restocking. So how do we actively manage and stock forests so that they store more carbon? 3, silvopasture and cropland agroforestry. This is the incorporation of trees into agricultural systems, whether that be ranching or crop production in order to store carbon. And then finally, urban reforestation. And all of these approaches together across different geographies can really make a meaningful impact on our carbon balance. One other thing around forestry is that in addition to just keeping sort of these natural ecosystems very healthy and thriving, we can actually use harvested wood products like cross-laminated timber, plywood, fiberboard as means for long-term carbon storage. These are things that would be most often used in building materials and really replace very carbon-intensive industries like steel and concrete. So building materials and construction right now account for 11% of total greenhouse gas emissions across the globe. And so if we can offset that with harvested wood products that also provide long-term carbon storage, that is a really powerful mitigation technique. It could result in a significant impact on the climate. And in addition to that, there's also a really big market for these products. So there's an estimated 12.5 billion domestic market for harvested wood products. And that's something that can drive job creation, within processing facilities and the creation of these products that creates a really powerful economic driver, especially for rural communities. On the agriculture side, we think a lot about storing carbon in soils through the use of specific management practices. So again, crops naturally store carbon in soils throughout their sort of growing season. but a lot of times conventional agricultural practices actually release the carbon stored in soils back into the air. So there are a number of different practices, things like conservation tillage, cover cropping, double cropping, managed grazing, and compost application that can encourage more carbon sequestration in soils and also encourage that carbon that's already in soils to stay there. And the great news about this is that it often goes hand in hand with things that farmers care about, like protecting soil health, increasing yields, reducing the need for synthetic fertilizers, increasing farmer resilience to drought and flood. And so there are a number of groups, including Carbon 180, who's looking to figure out how do we scale the adoption of some of these practices across the US, knowing that US agriculture is very diverse. And one practice that works in a cornfield in Idaho is not going to be the same practice that can be applied to an almond orchard in California. And there's a lot of scientific uncertainty about across the US how these practices actually store carbon in those very specific agricultural contexts. So for example, we do have a lot of information on Midwestern row crop agriculture. We have a lot less information on ranching in the West and the Rocky Mountain West. So there's just a lot more research that needs to be done to understand how these practices actually result in meaningful carbon outcomes. And then two, how do you actually measure that? Right now, measuring carbon in soils is extremely expensive and time consuming. And so it's also about how do we create the tools that actually help us measure and therefore manage carbon in soils. Again, these solutions are pretty low in cost, similar to forestry, but also have those durability challenges where any carbon that's stored, if farmers change practices, it gets released sort of back into the atmosphere. And the solutions I mentioned, or the practices that I mentioned, are really focused around changing production systems, but there are also a number of research institutions that are working on developing agricultural crops that actually would store more carbon in the soils without changing those sort of production or operation systems. So there are folks who are working on developing crops that have deeper, larger root systems, crops that produce more suberin, which helps root systems resist decomposition and therefore store more carbon. And then finally, there are groups who are looking to perennialize standard food crops so that sort of less tillage is necessary and you're able to keep those crops and disturb the soil less than you would with traditional annual crops. And then moving over to sort of the tech solutions, I wanted to chat and sort of get in depth on direct air capture. Again, these are really essentially those giant fans that capture carbon from the atmosphere using chemical reactions. This is a really promising solution, though it has a really high cost today. The current cost for direct air capture is around $200 to $300 per ton of CO2. Just to compare that to the land sector solutions, which range to more about like $10 to $30 per ton of CO2. So you're really looking at an order of magnitude increase in cost for capturing the carbon. But it also comes with a number of advantages. One, it has really high scale potential. So we're not limited by the amount of land that we have in the same way that we are around agriculture and forestry. And then two, the carbon that's captured and stored is really stable. It's stored on timescales of hundreds to thousands of years. And so when we're thinking about solving the climate crisis on a scale of around 100 years or these geologic timescales, that permanent carbon storage is really important. So just to talk a little bit about how direct air capture actually works and how this process works. Again, you have these giant fans that really suck carbon dioxide, as well as just sort of normal air, the air that we're all breathing, into a fan. On the other side, there will be a chemical material, either a solvent or a sorbent, that's going to react with just that ambient air, and it's going to selectively bind with the CO2. When it selectively binds with the CO2, you're able to release whatever is sort of remaining in the air back into the atmosphere, and then you're left with that chemical material that's attached to the CO2. We then either add heat or electricity, which encourages the chemical material to basically split with the CO2, and you're left with just a pure stream of CO2. that we can then either store in geologic reservoirs, which we have pretty big capacity across the US. You essentially inject it underground into sort of these empty saline aquifers, or you can actually use that CO2 to create really valuable products like chemicals or building materials. And the products that we have now, the ones that are listed, plastics, chemicals, fuels, building materials, and even CO2 that's used for like our Coca-Cola or used in welding tanks. Those are all things that today are fossil derived. And so the extent to which we can replace those products with products that are made from CO2, we can actually have a very large carbon benefit. Carbon 180 did an analysis to understand what's the total available market size for products that are currently made from fossil derived carbon. And we found that these products could be replaced with CO2 from technologies like direct air capture, and really can access a market size that's over $1 trillion in the US and over $6 trillion globally. So it's not just good for the climate, it actually can provide a ton of economic opportunity for businesses across the US. I also wanted to show this direct air capture map. This is actually an interactive tool that is on our website that currently lists all of the research and commercial scale pilots that are happening across the US for direct air capture. Right now, there are about a dozen commercial scale pilots that are capturing on the scale of thousands of tons of CO2 per year. And the biggest plant is currently sort of in construction that's planning to capture 1 million tons of CO2 per year, which is all extremely promising. But just to sort of take us back to that 10 gigaton number, we need to be capturing billions of tons of CO2. And right now we're in the thousands. So we really need to think about how do we scale up these solutions, build bigger plants, achieve economies of scale, and also move beyond sort of these first initial projects. So altogether, I think these solutions are facing a couple barriers. First is high cost and immature markets. No one is paying people to capture carbon today. And a lot of the entrepreneurs who are developing these solutions are sort of struggling to make the business case work, especially when they're operating on sort of such small scales today. Two are social and environmental impacts. So one, in minimizing any risk or harm that would happen to communities in which these solutions are implemented, but also making sure that we actually emphasize the benefits that are possible with these solutions. So where can we create jobs? Where can we invest in local industries and economies and or find synergies with other environmental benefits and really emphasize those to support communities, especially adapting to climate change? And then three is science risk. A lot of these technologies or solutions have not been proven at scale yet. And it's really important for us to make sure that they're actually effective at removing carbon over long time scales before we invest a lot of money in implementing them. And I think that leaves us really with one big question, like, how do we make this happen? This is a lot of really promising research. It's interesting, it's like fun to geek out on, but like, how do we actually implement change or create change and build essentially a very large new industry that would help fight climate change? And today I want to chat about how policy can really get us there. Policy is not the only lever for how we bring these solutions to scale, but it's a really powerful tool. And the government actually has a really long history of bringing new industries to fruition. And the first example that I want to talk about is actually our iPhones. And so I think a lot of times we sort of, the impact of the government and publicly funded research is often hidden from the public, but Apple didn't actually invent the iPhone overnight. It's not something that they created every component of. It's actually a technology that was enabled by decades of government research. So everything that you see on the iPhone screen, the government really had a hand in developing. So for example, Apple Maps today is enabled by government satellite technology. The weather app is enabled by NASA weather stations. The internet is a product of 2 decades of government research, and the same goes for camera, voice to text, touchscreen. And so the government actually really had an important role in developing these foundational technologies, exporting it to the private sector, and allowing the private sector to innovate and create products for the public. And so that foundational science that the government does can really change the way our world works. Like, we all carry smartphones in our hand now. There are a number of other competitors with Apple. And so I think we want to figure out how we can apply that playbook of public-private partnerships to government technology, or excuse me, to climate technology. And that's really what Carbon 180 was founded to do. We really combine this promising research, these early businesses and entrepreneurs, with policy as this core lever for change. And I want to dive a little bit more into how the federal government works and really what are the tools in the toolkit that we have to support these solutions. So there are sort of three core functions and three levers that we can pull to bring these solutions to scale. The first is research, development, and deployment, so RD&D. How do we develop and test new technology? How do we do, again, that foundational science that we know industry will need, but actually they can't finance today because they don't see the business model or that type of money isn't available. Two is incentives. How do we encourage the private sector to begin deploying technologies that are market ready through things like tax credits, market mechanisms, direct payments, and use those incentives, especially for early technologies, to make the business case a little bit more credible. And then three is around infrastructure. How do we support deployment by financing these shared resources? And I think this one feels a little bit more abstract. So just to give an example, the government often subsidizes power lines because private companies really can't pay for that, like, electricity transmission infrastructure themselves. And so what are the sort of shared resources that many companies will benefit from and that can't pay as like single businesses, and how can the government help facilitate those large projects? And we actually have a pretty good case study of how this works across other climate technologies. Solar is a really popular example. So since the 1970s, the US government has been working on solar technology, and particularly working on bringing down the cost of solar so that it's what we call at price parity with fossil-derived energy sources like coal and natural gas. So over the last decade, you can see this price curve on the left of solar prices over the last couple of decades, moving from in the 70s to over $70 per watt to now less than 70 cents per watt, which is a huge price decrease, and actually has even gone further than that in this graph, and even beyond. It only goes to 2014. And really, this price decline, you can actually chart with various government interventions. So there were regulations that the government instituted around net metering that helped encourage solar deployment. The government actually had what's called a Sunshot R&D program that invested in solar technologies and helped made them more mature, and created incentives like the production and investment tax credit for renewable energy. And so I think this is just another really good example of how the US federal government uses all three of those levers to really drive down the cost of technologies and help them scale. And we've actually been able to make pretty significant progress over the last 5 years in terms of wins for carbon removal and beginning to get the government, one, educated on the need for carbon removal, and two, begin deploying some of those tools in their toolkit. So I won't go into sort of all of these in detail, but just want to touch upon a couple wins. The first is around R&D funding. When Carbon 180 started, there was actually about $100,000 ever given from the federal government to carbon removal solutions. Over time, we've seen that increase to over $450 million in the latest omnibus bill, which passed in December for carbon removal, and actually created a dedicated research program for carbon removal at the Department of Energy. We see similar funding levels continue to increase at the USDA, at the Forest Service, and the Department of Defense. So we're seeing really Congress get serious about using the research capacity of the federal government to help make these solutions more mature. On the incentive side, there are sort of two big wins over the past couple years. First is the 45Q tax credit. This is a tax credit for carbon capture and storage, including direct air capture. And it provides companies a payment of up to $50 per ton of CO2 for the capture and storage of carbon, or $35 per ton of CO2 for the beneficial use of carbon, which again would be the conversion of carbon dioxide into those products that we talked about, like fuels, chemicals, building materials. In addition to that, in the 2015 Farm Bill, we saw a lot of emphasis on soil carbon, and soil carbon was explicitly carved out as a priority for a lot of the big conservation programs. So the first was the Conservation Stewardship Program. The second was the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And these are two programs that farmers have historically used. They're extremely popular, especially in the Midwest, to adopt new practices, particularly conservation practices on their farm. And what happens is they apply for this funding and they get a grant that's usually 1 to 3 years long that helps them finance the operation change and also provides them with technical assistance so they actually know how to best implement it on their farm. And so we saw the Congress in that Farm Bill really call out soil carbon as a priority. And hopefully we'll see them continue to sort of prioritize those conservation grant programs to farmers who are looking to store carbon in their soils. And then we also saw the establishment of soil health demonstration trials to really get at that research question that I mentioned earlier around understanding the geographic variability of implementing carbon storage practices across the US, across the diversity of the US agriculture system. And then finally, around infrastructure, we've had a few wins here. In the recent omnibus bill that I mentioned, the pieces of what's called the Use It Act were passed that are really focused on helping build infrastructure to support carbon capture and direct air capture. And then 2, providing technical assistance to farmers, specifically the NRCS, and supporting their local offices in giving farmers the expertise and training that they need to adopt some of these practices if they're interested. And I think we've been able to make, I think what's been really promising over the past few years, our DC office is actually only 2 years old, but there's been so much momentum and interest around carbon removal solutions and how the federal government can support scaling these solutions. It's something that's been historically very bipartisan because it's cross-sector or cross-industry. There are a number of members who have been really interested in introducing legislation across all of the various carbon removal solutions. And I think we're at a really great inflection point, especially with the Biden administration taking leadership on some of these solutions and Congress looking this year to pass climate legislation to really embed carbon removal more specifically in that climate conversation. Again, these are very new, even to people who work in the climate space. Carbon removal is not well known, and we've seen that profile start to become more public. And I think this might be an opportunity for us to really go big on federal investment in these solutions. A couple wins that have already happened this year, especially from the Biden administration, a lot of the early appointee picks for the different agencies, particularly at the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Energy, are carbon removal experts. So we're seeing them interested in bringing in that expertise and really making sure that they can carry out some of that foundational research. 2, there was the creation of an ARPA climate program. ARPA is an advanced research agency that does really robust and applied research. There's a ARPA-E at the Department of Energy, there's a DARPA at the Department of Defense, and then the GARDA at the USDA. And so there's a really popular, highly effective research programs. And the Biden administration created one around climate change and specifically called out the need to look at forestry, agriculture, and direct air capture solutions. And we're also hoping, as the president releases his first budget later this year, that carbon removal might be included in some of those funding recommendations to Congress. And then finally, I think Congress is already being really ambitious about what they want to pass this year. I think there are a number of opportunities in which carbon removal could be included. One is around any stimulus legislation. Two is around an infrastructure package. And then three, there's a possibility that we might move forward with a reconciliation package, which is basically a legislation tool that allows Congress to fast track particularly items that affect federal spending. And so that might be an area in which we see some increased research funding or incentives for these solutions. So overall, really optimistic about what we've been able to accomplish so far, and really see this next year as that critical point where we move beyond incremental change and incremental investment to really thinking about holistically, how do we scale this new industry? How do we bring carbon removal solutions to fruition? And how do we make sure that we sort of build this new carbon economy that's really focused on not just putting carbon in the atmosphere, but how do we actually take it out and make sure that we're avoiding those worst impacts of climate change? So that's really all I wanted to share today. Again, so grateful to be able to chat with the MJC community. If you're interested in learning more, we have a ton of educational materials on our website. It's at carbon180.org. We also have a weekly newsletter that shares sort of any updates from the carbon removal field. And we will also be having a number of job descriptions up in the next couple of weeks if you're interested in working with us. Thanks again.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you so much. We do have some questions here in our chat. I'll just start off. I'm going to go down if you don't mind answering a few.
Love it. Yeah.
The first one is from Soul King, and it says, what happens if we somehow take too much carbon out of the atmosphere?
Great question. It's highly unlikely that we would take too much carbon out of the atmosphere, just because of the amount of carbon that's actually in the atmosphere. So since the Industrial Revolution, we've put 2 trillion tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's actually very difficult to take out. So I think it's difficult and currently expensive. So I would think that we would not remove more carbon than we need to. That being said, we have a ton of research stations across the US, including a very famous one actually in Hawaii that continues to monitor atmospheric concentrations of CO2. They measure it in what's called ppms. So right now we're over 400 ppm, and folks are looking to bring that down closer to around 350. Pre-industrial levels are at around 300. So we do actually have the science and technology to monitor that progress and make sure that we're staying at safe atmospheric levels. In addition to that, we're also continuing to release carbon. Countries all over the globe, while many of them have plans to reduce emissions, are still releasing them. So I think we're just very far off from that sort of situation. And I would love for that to be where we are, because it would be, I think, a lot easier to solve for.
I agree. I wish that was the predicament we were in right now. Our next question comes from Bill Anelli. He's one of our professors here at MJC. Our local representative, Josh Harder, introduced the Farm Act in 2020 to incentivize farmers to sequester carbon, including techniques like pyrolysis. Curious about your thoughts on this legislation.
Yes, I think it's great that we're seeing Congress people, and especially Josh Harder, was super excited to see him interested in carbon sequestration. A lot of that bill focuses on a specific carbon removal technology around the use of bioenergy to either create electricity or to create what's called biochar, which can actually be a really powerful soil amendment. I think the legislation itself signals an interest in carbon removal, which is really exciting, and also focuses on really these types of pilot projects that might answer some key research questions that we have around those technologies. Like I said, a lot of these solutions are pretty immature, so it's important for us to figure out those research needs in advance. And I think this bill can be an important step towards that.
Awesome. And then the next question is from Aaron Thompson. What are your thoughts on Elon Musk's $100 million carbon removal X Prize?
Yeah, absolutely. So for folks who don't know, Elon Musk recently committed $100 million for a technology particularly focused on sort of direct air capture like technology that can remove carbon from the atmosphere at the billion-ton scale. This is extremely exciting and promising. The X Prize folks actually had a prize over the past couple of years that just ramped up around carbon utilization. So again, that's the conversion of carbon to products. So the people that Elon Musk has partnered with are real experts in this space, and they know how to design successful prizes. So really promising to see such a big price tag around the prize, and hopefully it encourages entrepreneurs to really enter this space. I think in addition to that very attractive 100 million flag, it's actually difficult for entrepreneurs to finance research or finance demonstration projects without any sort of interim funding. So I think there's actually a role for the federal government to provide that sort of near-term support to actually help entrepreneurs access that larger price tag at the end. So again, I think it's important for the public sector and the private sector to really collaborate on this development, but very exciting and think it can have a really big impact.
Yeah, it'd be nice to see lots of people offer those carrots, I think.
Yeah.
We have another question regarding injecting CO2 into the ground. And this is from Denise Godbout-Avant, and just wondering if there are concerns about safety.
Yes, it's a really good question. Again, these are all great questions. We actually, within the US and across the globe, have a lot of experience injecting CO2 through traditional carbon capture. So instead of capturing carbon through the air, you capture carbon either from an electricity power plant or an industrial plant, something that's making cement or steel. There are dozens of projects across the globe where they're actually capturing that carbon and storing it underground and monitoring both the local environmental and community impacts, as well as the sort of long-term carbon storage. We do know how to do it safely, but I think there's a lot of work that we can do to strengthen the regulations that the EPA has around making sure that we are keeping our community safe when we're injecting it underground. It's a little bit different than fossil fuel extraction, which is what a lot of people think when we talk about geologic storage. But because you're, instead of taking stuff out of the ground where you're destabilizing a lot of the local geology, you're actually repressurizing oftentimes used fossil fuel wells, which can actually be beneficial. So it's a tough question, but I think one that we've really had decades of research on and can deploy safely with the right regulations.
Okay, yeah, makes a lot of sense. And then what are your feelings about carbon fee dividend projects where low-income folks from costs of carbon pricing? I'm not quite sure. Oh no. Well, kind of the idea of having fee and dividend, if you've heard of CCL before, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways that people think about creating the right incentives for us to reduce carbon. A lot of times this is with economy-wide market mechanisms. So either a carbon tax, a cap and trade program like the one California has, or the carbon fee and dividend idea. I think these are really important levers that can help reduce carbon with the tools that we already have in our toolkit, but they're not particularly effective for developing new technologies. Really, it's about implementation. So it's a piece of the puzzle in terms of what we need to do to like fix climate change and drive that sort of implementation of low carbon technologies. But I think especially for carbon removal, as we're thinking about creating new industries, we sort of need to pair it with these sort of other policy levers that I talked about. So might be something that's more suitable for things like renewables and electric vehicles as opposed to carbon removal solutions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, this is from Joshua S. Is it worth trying to reduce my carbon footprint as an individual, or is the carbon emission of an individual essentially inconsequential compared to industry?
This is a tough question. I think there is, some benefit to reducing our individual footprint because it really connects us to the impact or like the impacts of our daily lives on climate. That being said, I think the most powerful individual action that anyone can have is working to get like effective climate champions into our local, state, and federal governments, either through campaigning, donating to their campaigns, encouraging voter turnout, and then also holding those elected officials accountable. And I just want to emphasize that it's not necessarily just something about like your senator or your member of Congress, but oftentimes local representatives, transportation boards, city council members have a really big impact on the carbon intensity of our communities, so our cities and our regions. And so just really encourage people to think about that as another way that they can, help fight climate change, just because a lot of times personal carbon footprint reduction isn't always accessible. It's not always something that we can pay for. It's not always available in every region. And I think sort of switching it on its head and thinking about how can we really create that powerful political change as individuals is really promising, has a huge impact, and it's something that's been really effective for me personally as well.
Yeah, I agree about that. I think the more of us that are involved, and when I hear about other people doing similar things that I've done to try to lower my carbon impact, I'm like, okay, well, if enough of us are doing it, we do have a little bit of an impact overall. I think that's great. There's another question that I think is interesting. Does direct air capture remove more carbon than it took to make the machine to do the job?
There are a lot of people who are working on what's called life cycle assessments for direct air capture, which really answer this question of from construction to capture, what's the actual emissions balance that you get at the end. What really matters here is the energy source that you're using and how carbon intensive that is. So you could power your direct air capture plant with natural gas, and that might not make it carbon negative or even carbon neutral. What's important is that we power these technologies with renewable energy or waste energy. The picture of the direct air capture machine that I had posted was one of in Zurich in Switzerland, and it's actually co-located with a power plant that produces waste heat. So they're actually using the waste heat that would otherwise have no purpose to power the direct air capture. So we need to sort of find these synergies in which we either have excess electricity or excess heat, which definitely does happen across the globe, and use that to power the direct air capture machines rather than just using fossil fuels to capture carbon, which is not super efficient.
Yeah, no, I agree. We have one comment here. Wonderful talk. Makes me more hopeful that we have many tools to help reduce climate change. And there were a few other comments that they enjoyed your talk today. So I really appreciate you joining us. I feel so positive about your talk today that at some point I would actually like to invite you back if you'd be interested for Modesto Area Partners in Science. We have a once a month talk, and we advertise this quite a bit more also to our local high schools and community. And so it'd be real fun to have you back, and I think a lot of students would be inspired in kind of what you're doing right now. So
yeah, I would love that.
Right.
Always happy to share more about this work. And I think Glad to hear people enjoyed it. I think I work on this stuff because climate change can often feel very scary. But actually, when you're equipped with the solutions and can think about how do we actually create a better world instead of just trying to solve a problem, I think it can be really powerful and really personally motivating. So really appreciative that I got to share a little bit about that work today.
Awesome. Yeah, no, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Hey, Troy, did you have anything else to mention today?
I don't, I don't think so, but I do want to definitely thank Giana for coming. It's great to see her here today. Again, hopefully her dad and mom made it on. They're locals here, so hopefully they got to make it on and watch the presentation. I appreciate it so much, Giana. I think I was looking at comments too, and everybody really appreciated your speech and your delivery today. So thank you very much for joining us from Wahoo. We won't hold that against you that you're vacationing while we're here. But thank you once again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. All right, bye for today, guys.
Thanks, everyone.